In July of 1518, a woman stepped into a street in the city of Strasbourg and began to dance. She had no music. No one had asked her to. And she could not stop. Not that hour, not that night, not for days. By the time anyone thought to intervene, dozens of her neighbors had joined her, dancing in the same square, with the same blank, exhausted look on their faces, as if their legs no longer belonged to them.
This is not folklore. It is one of the strangest documented events in European history, recorded by physicians, city clerks, and the Strasbourg Council itself, in a city that kept unusually careful records for its time. Strasbourg, in the summer of 1518, was a free imperial city on the Rhine, prosperous by medieval standards, but freshly battered. Grain harvests had failed 3 years running. Famine had pushed peasants into open revolt. Smallpox and syphilis were moving through the population. People were hungry, frightened, and worn down. In the exact way that, centuries later, doctors would recognize as fertile ground for the mind to break, in unusual directions.
The woman's name, according to surviving city records, was Frau Troffea. Her husband later testified that there had been no warning, no illness, no explanation he could offer. She simply walked outside and started to move, jerking and swaying through the streets with an intensity that drew a crowd. She danced through that first day without rest. She danced into the evening. Bystanders assumed exhaustion would end it. It didn't. She kept going for somewhere between 4 and 6 days by most accounts, until her body simply gave out.
By the time Frau Troffea collapsed, it was already too late to contain. Within a week, more than 30 people were dancing alongside her, seized by the same compulsion, in the same square, for no reason any of them could explain when asked. They weren't celebrating. Witnesses described grim, joyless faces. Bodies moving long after exhaustion should have stopped them, some until their feet bled inside their shoes. Whatever this was, it was spreading, and Strasbourg's city council decided it needed a medical explanation, fast.
The city brought in physicians, who diagnosed the outbreak using the medical framework of the day. An imbalance of hot blood. A fever of the mind that had to be worked out of the body rather than suppressed. Their prescribed treatment was, in hindsight, one of the worst medical decisions in recorded history. Don't stop the dancers. Help them dance more. The council took the advice seriously, and what happened next turned a strange local incident into a full-blown civic catastrophe.
Guild halls were emptied. An open-air stage was built in the grain market. The council paid for musicians, fifes and drums, and hired professional dancers to keep the rhythm going, believing that if the afflicted could just dance the fever out of their systems, the episode would burn itself to completion. For a few surreal days, Strasbourg had, by official city sanction, a non-stop public dance floor built specifically to contain a plague of uncontrollable dancing. It did not work. It made things dramatically worse.
Instead of tiring themselves into recovery, more residents were drawn in, some historians argue, pulled toward the spectacle by the same collective, contagious anxiety that had triggered it in the first place. The numbers climbed through July and into August. Contemporary accounts and later historical analysis put the peak at roughly 400 people dancing at once, in a city with a population of only around 20,000. That is something close to 2% of the entire city, moving uncontrollably in the streets at the same time.
And people were dying. Contemporary chroniclers described dancers collapsing from heart attacks, strokes, and pure physical exhaustion day after day in front of the crowds that gathered to watch. The exact death toll has never been settled. Some surviving records point to a smaller number, and later historians, working from broader city mortality figures for that summer, have suggested a toll as high as several hundred. What every source agrees on is that people did die, in public, still dancing, and that the city had, by its own choice, made the crisis worse before it got better.
Eventually, city leaders reversed course completely. Music and dancing were banned outright. Authorities loaded the worst afflicted onto carts and hauled them out of the city, to a mountain shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, a saint that medieval Europeans specifically associated with a curse of compulsive dancing. There, in a ritual meant to lift that curse, the dancers were made to wear red shoes, blessed with holy water, and walk before a wooden statue of the saint. Whether it was the ritual, the removal from the crowd that had been feeding the spectacle, or simple time, the epidemic began to fade soon after.
By September, roughly 2 months after Frau Troffea first stepped into the street, the dancing plague of Strasbourg had run its course. No new cases were recorded. The stage in the grain market came down, and the city, having lived through a 2-month episode of mass uncontrollable movement that killed an unknown number of its own residents, largely stopped talking about it. It shows up mostly in city account books, tracking what the council spent on musicians, and in a handful of physicians' notes. There was no grand explanation offered at the time, because nobody had one.
Modern researchers have spent 5 centuries trying to answer the question the city council couldn't. The most popular theory is ergot poisoning, a toxic mold that grows on damp rye and produces effects similar to LSD, since it shares a chemical ancestor with the compound. It's a tempting explanation, but the physical evidence works against it. Ergot poisoning, in its convulsive form, causes violent, involuntary spasms and hallucinations, yes. But its other, equally common form cuts off blood flow to the extremities so severely that victims lose fingers and toes to gangrene. Someone in the grip of ergotism does not have the circulatory capacity to dance continuously for days. Their limbs fail long before their will does.
The theory most historians now favor instead is mass psychogenic illness, a stress-induced, involuntary trance state that spreads through a population the way panic or laughter can spread through a crowd, not through any pathogen, but through shared belief and shared fear. Strasbourg in 1518 had every ingredient for it. A population starved, sick, and terrified, living under the real medieval belief that Saint Vitus could curse a sinner with unstoppable dancing. Once one woman appeared to be living out that exact curse in public, the psychological conditions were in place for others, primed by the same fear, to begin experiencing the same involuntary break.
And Strasbourg was not alone. Smaller outbreaks of compulsive dancing were recorded across medieval Europe for centuries before 1518, including a documented episode in Aachen in 1374 that spread along the Rhine into neighboring towns. Strasbourg's case simply happened to occur in a city organized enough to leave behind unusually detailed records and unlucky enough to have a city council whose intervention made the outbreak far larger and far deadlier than it likely would have been on its own.
No blood tests exist from 1518. No bodies have been exhumed for toxicology. Everything historians work with is second-hand. City ledgers, physicians' letters, and accounts written by people who were, themselves, terrified by what they were watching. That's the honest, unglamorous truth behind almost every unsolved historical mystery. It's not usually that the explanation is impossible to find. It's that the evidence that would prove it beyond doubt simply never got written down, or didn't survive 500 years to reach us.
So the dancing plague of 1518 sits exactly where it started. Real, witnessed, documented by the very city government that tried and failed to dance it away, and still not fully explained. A few dozen people started it. Roughly 400 joined it. An unknown number died from it. And somewhere in that grain market, in Strasbourg, for 2 months in the summer of 1518, hundreds of human bodies moved without their owner's permission, and nobody, then or now, has ever been able to fully say why.